Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today is Paul Melly. He's a journalist focusing on development, politics, and business issues in Africa and the Middle East, and he's contributed to publications like Africa Confidential, EIU, Oxford Analytica, and the EU Institute for Security Studies. He is also a consulting fellow at the Africa program for Chatham House. I don't know Paul personally. I actually saw him quoted in an article and reached out to him because I was looking for subject matter experts on what's going on in the Sahel and Niger. And Paul was nice enough to answer my email and make an hour of his time to come talk to us and share his insights. This was truly an excellent episode. I don't think that there are many experts in English language who are talking about the situation in the Sahel, which is something we've been talking about here for a while, but which I admittedly am not an expert on, and I'm trying to get smart on as fast as I can. So thanks again, Paul, for making the time. I thought he really offered some very interesting perspectives, and I learned a lot, and I hope you will all learn a lot too. In the show notes, listeners, there will be a link to a map of the Sahel and to Western Africa in general. It's true of most of our podcasts, but in general, this is a part of the world that I think most listeners don't know the geography as well as they think they do. So I would suggest looking at that map because it communicates a lot about the situation that is going on. There will also be a link to former President Bazoum's recent op-ed in the Washington Post, if you would like to read that as well. Otherwise, email me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you want to talk more about the podcast, about the research and consulting services that we offer at CI, or if you're interested in learning more about becoming a wealth management client. We had some survey respondents to the podcast say that they didn't even know that we're in the business of managing money. Well, we are, and we are open for clients. So if you're interested in that, please don't hesitate to reach out. If you're not interested in that and you're just here for the podcast material, I'll shut up now. Cheers and see you out. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right, well, fresh off of what did you say? It was a natural gas leak or a natural gas scare at his normal office. Paul Melly has joined us to give us some insights about Niger. Paul, thanks for making the time amidst all the chaos over there.
No, you're very welcome, Jacob. No worries at all. Yeah, we just had someone reported the smell of gas in our building, and so security check, everybody's got kicked out. Luckily, the company has another building across the street, so I've just moved over here.
Well, it's nice. I look forward to being in a future where my company has another building across the street as well. But for now, I'm just in my home office.
Well, it's the real estate company. It's not us, me as a journalist or our little collective of researchers and reporters. But we rent some space in a company that rents space, basically. So
okay.
Yeah.
Well, Paul, I reached out to you it's actually not so easy to find experts on the Sahel or Western Africa or Niger that speak English and that are willing to come on podcasts and talk about them. And so I don't actually know a ton about you, and I'm sure our audience doesn't either. So I thought I would start with sort of what is your background and how did you get interested in Africa? I know that you've been a journalist covering it for many years, but I thought I'd give you just a minute to talk about your background and where you're coming at this topic from.
Yeah, so basically, I've always been fascinated by West Africa, and I also have quite a deep interest in French culture and Francophone universe, if you like. And so those two things very much cross paths in the west of Africa, obviously because the majority of the countries in the region are Francophone by sort of historical inheritance from the colonial era, which means that what people speak at home is X, Y, or Z African language, but the language of government, media, politics is French. And another dimension to my interests is that I've always been very interested in development, grassroots development. And so in the west of Africa, that's obviously quite an important facet because particularly in the Sahel, And these are the countries along the southern fringe of the Sahara. They're very arid. It only rains for 2 or 3 months a year. All the challenges of food security, of helping people develop rural livelihoods, of expanding education in a region where there was very little formal education a long time ago, but now school enrollment is rising quite far. Uh, all of those things sort of feed in as well. And it's a region that's very much impacted by climate change. So all of those big environmental challenges, desertification, rising temperatures impact. And that overlaps with the politics. And so my interests as a journalist and my interests in development sort of kind of cross paths, if you like. That's my background. And I was a journalist for a long time only, and then over the last 10, 15 years, I've become increasingly involved in research things. I'm attached to the think tank Chatham House, the Africa program there, focusing on Francophone Africa, particularly the Sahel. So that's more or less my kind of background.
Yeah, and are there any particular countries that you feel that are sort of your specialty, or is it really just Francophone Africa and the Sahel in general?
Well, I wouldn't say Francophone Africa totally, because there's a part of Francophone Africa, the Great Lakes Basin, the whole area of Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, Rwanda. I have visited, but that's not my main subject. And the majority of my time is focused on the west of Africa. So the countries sort of ranging Senegal, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, and coastal countries like Togo and Benin. And particularly with the security crisis that's developed in the Sahel over recent years, that has really come to dominate a lot of my workload, just because that's what many people are interested in. So people need a lot of coverage, both from the media point of view, what I'm doing as a reporter, but also development agencies, think tanks. When it comes to sort of larger research pieces, a lot of that is focused on these countries. So I've written kind of long form reports on food security in the Sahel, politics in Mauritania, French foreign policy in Africa, Nigeria's trade relations with its Francophone neighbors. And I'm not a Nigeria specialist in general, but I've worked on some particular themes that regional reports where Nigeria has been an important dimension. So given that Nigeria is obviously a crucial country in the African continent with 220 million people, the continent's biggest economy, and in West Africa, obviously, by far the largest actor, that adds a sort of useful dimension of understanding.
Yeah, and I'm sure we will get. We can't talk about Niger and not talk about Nigeria because of some of the issues there, but I'm sure we will get to that in the course of the conversation. The question I wanted to start off with is, and I think about this also in terms of economic development in general, but if you look, and Niger's president, who is, I guess, under house arrest or whatever, but is still writing articles for the Washington Post, said this in his op-ed column that the Washington Post published at the end of last week. Niger doesn't seem like the odds-on favorite for this kind of instability. Since this democratically elected government has taken over, security issues have actually improved in both the south of the north and the country. GDP growth rates are up over 7%. They've done incredibly well. And yet, Niger has followed the pattern of Mali, of Burkina Faso, of Chad, of some of these other countries that have had really meaningful security challenges, and where you can at least start to wrap your brain around the idea that, okay, a military is intervening because there is this basic unhappiness with the situation and what they were doing before isn't working and things like that. But Niger seemed to be the shining example of what was working. And it's one of the reasons it had so many partnerships with Western governments and things like that. Was it surprising to you that we saw Niger now fall to the sort of same style military coups, or are we exaggerating the extent to which things were kind of good in Niger? I'm starting there and then we'll zoom backwards. But it seems like this coup is not it seems different than all the others that have affected the region over the past 18, 24 months.
I think that last point is right. And it is true that Niger's track record is significantly more successful, particularly in regards to security, but also on the development side of things, than Mali and in the last year or two, Burkina Faso. In Burkina, for example, it's now estimated that somewhere around 60-70% of the territory of the country is out of the control of the government. In Mali, that's the situation's probably not quite so dramatic, but in some ways it's more complicated because of very difficult dynamics in politics in the north of Mali, where you don't just have jihadist groups, but you also have separatist movements that are in a peace process, but which risks being destabilized by the spread of violence. Compared with that, the challenges that Niger has faced have been, shall we say, a bit more contained. There has been quite a lot of violence, particularly in the western border areas, a region which is called Tillabéri region. That is basically, when you look at the map of Niger, you can see a sort of small mini panhandle, as it were, on the western edge of the map, surrounding the capital, Niamey. And that's the region that's been most affected by jihadist violence. Some of it overspilling the borders from Burkina Faso and Mali, particularly from areas where the governments of those countries have either a very tenuous hold or no real hold at all. But there have actually been there's a degree of jihadist activity and also tensions between communities, pressures competing over grazing land, for example, or other disputes that have fed into the violence. So it's not entirely an external thing. And to come back to your original question, Niger appeared to be doing much better than the rest of the region. That's true if you look at the bold statistics. Certainly, the number of attacks and the number of people killed is a lot lower by several degrees of magnitude, for example, by comparison, say, with Burkina Faso. But for a country that was peaceful a decade ago, that is still a measure of what people in Niger are comparing it to is not the situation in Mali or the situation in Burkina or the situation in northeast Nigeria where Boko Haram have been active. They're comparing it to what it was like at home 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, it was more secure, it was more peaceful. Now, in the face of the massive regional security crisis that's affecting so much of the Sahel, the Niger government has done a pretty effective job. And under President Bazoum, the president who's currently being detained by the military putschists, the situation has at least stabilized and may even have improved a bit. But it still doesn't feel easy. You can apply the same perspective, if you like, to development and poverty issues. Niger is one of the poorest countries in the world. Now, actually, if you look with a rather dry economist's view, you can see that GDP per capita, so economic output on average for every person, has been going up. Incomes have been edging up slightly in real terms over quite a long time. You can see that life expectancy figures and health indicators are getting gradually a bit better. And they're actually, some of those health indicators are significantly better than countries that are much richer within the African continent. But once again, if you are a very poor villager living in those very challenging environmental conditions I mentioned at the outset, with just a few months rain a year, impacted by climate change and hot season temperatures, we're talking, I'm afraid I'm not very strong on Fahrenheit, but in centigrade terms, we're talking by temperatures routinely in the upper 40s centigrade during the hot season for prolonged periods. So, for those of you who are listening in the US, the sort of heat wave conditions that have been reported from places like southern Arizona in recent months, that is the standard norm in Niger for several months of the year. Absolutely basic. And people are carrying out manual agriculture in those very demanding conditions. And in most of Niger, it doesn't rain for 9 months. Almost all of the country, it doesn't rain for 9 months of the year. So you have a very slender wet season window to try and grow your basic food supply. So although things have actually been getting slowly better, it doesn't feel like there's been a dramatic improvement. It's by comparison, looking from the outside, that we can see that actually the government under President Bazoum and his predecessor, Mahamadou Issoufou, has maintained a fairly effective track record. And it didn't just start with them. Niger has, particularly on rural development, actually had quite a good longer track record in gradually improving conditions for its people. But having said all that, I think we should, and this may be a point where you want to jump in, Jacob, but I think it's fair to say you can't say that this coup was triggered by all that. The coups in Burkina Faso and in Mali fundamentally were triggered by the really desperate security situation and the impatience of military officers at the civilian leadership.
Mm-hmm.
In Guinea, which has also had a coup, the coup was triggered really by frustration among the population at the fact that the incumbent president, who'd been democratically elected, then rigged a referendum to get rid of the term limit so that he could run for another term in office, which he then secured through an election which was itself probably rigged. And so that created a climate of popular frustration. Also, there were pretty serious human rights abuses, security forces shooting demonstrators, that kind of thing. Created a climate where military officers felt empowered to move in. And that coup was greeted by cheering crowds in the streets, actually spontaneous crowds at the moment it happened. Niger is not like that. There wasn't, although people were undoubtedly feeling these pressures, progress is very slow, the security situation remains very fragile, development challenges very big. This coup does not seem to have been motivated by those factors. It seems, despite the claims of the officers who are leading it, it seems to be motivated by internal frustrations among a group of officers, some of whom feared that they might lose their jobs, some who feared that they had lost the trust of the president. It's very difficult to tell. The coup leaders answered General Tiani when he gave his first televised statement and trotted out all the usual reasons about security, bad governance, etc., etc., etc. That felt, as we say, again, I'm not sure in UK English what we call a boilerplate language. It's a pretty bog standard, routine language, just churning out the same old rhetoric, which other putschists had used before.
Well, and it really is a strange. Well, because I don't even know, can we even say that the coup was completed? Because it's a perfect lead into what I was going to ask you next, because this is not like any coup I've ever covered in my life or looked at in my life, because usually when the officers or the generals seize control, they take over the means of communication, the former leader is put into prison or is executed. I mean, Bazoum is sitting there, it seems, under house arrest. He's meeting foreign leaders, taking pictures with foreign leaders. He's publishing articles in the Washington Post. He's talking about all these things. He's talking about how the coup cannot succeed. It almost feels like everybody's saying, well, we haven't gone past the Rubicon quite yet. We can bring it bring it back in. And I mean, we're recording here on Tuesday, August 8th. We're not going to sit on this episode that long just because I'm afraid things are going to continue to develop over the next couple of days. But, if anything happens in the next 72 hours, we're recording here on August 8th. But it does feel like something is in flux. It doesn't necessarily seem like the coup has necessarily succeeded. Do you feel that it's kind of up in the air like that, and that could reflect what you mentioned with such a disgruntled group of officers who maybe have some control but not all the control, and now behind the scenes there's a lot of horse trading that we're not privy to?
I'm not so sure about that. I think in the very first day, it was a situation of horse trading. Basically, General Tiani, Abdurrahman Tiani, the commander of the Presidential Guard, ordered his men to prevent President Bazoum from leaving his house. So basically, you have a presidential palace, but it's actually, as it were, what you might call a sort of presidency complex. And in its grounds, both the head of state himself and some other people have their official villas, if you like. So Bazoum was in his official home, in his official residence. He had breakfast as normal. And then when he wished to leave, he was prevented from leaving by the soldiers who were there to guard him. And there was a day of what you might call haggling negotiation, where his predecessor, Mahamadou Issoufou, tried to persuade the putschist leader to climb down. So at that stage, it looked like a mutiny that might be negotiable.
Mm-hmm.
But the putschist leader refused. And essentially over the sort of night of the 26th, 27th July, the balance of momentum seems to have shifted. Enough of the army swung behind the coup, or at least the army leadership swung behind the coup. And essentially, the chiefs of staff of the Nigerian military said this situation had to be sorted out through negotiation, and therefore army units that were loyal to Bazoum, that were heading towards Niamey, should not do so. And there shouldn't be bloodshed within the Nigerian armed forces. There shouldn't be a fight over this. And that situation gave a degree of momentum to the putschists, because they were then effectively in control, and the loyalists stood down, held back. Loyalist troops who in fact had been guarding the national television station seemed to have moved away. And as a result, effectively now the military are very firmly in command, and they do appear, at least at the top public command level, to be relatively united. A number of officers who are known to have been very loyal to Bazoum have been arrested. Most of his ministers have been arrested, the ones who were in the country. Some were abroad. For example, the Prime Minister was at a conference on food security in Rome, and so escaped being arrested. It is now in Paris, because that's the center of the Francophone media. That's where he can make his political weight count. But this is a very difficult situation for anybody to unpick. Internally within Niger, it looks as if, the action that's been taken against Bazoum's political party, the PNDS party, its leader has been locked up. There's journalists are being intimidated, at least local journalists are being intimidated. Pressure, essentially, the new regime is signaling strongly that it is in charge. It's now today nominated a prime minister, a former finance minister who had in recent years been working for the African Development Bank, and it's trying to emit the signal, if you like, that it is in charge. It's also refusing to engage in the sort of process of negotiation that other West African putschist governments, putschist regimes, military juntas did after they had taken power. So when ECOWAS, the West African Regional Bloc, which is a kind of West African equivalent of the European Union, if you like, and of which Niger is a member, and which has rules about democracy and good governance, when ECOWAS sent a first delegation last Friday, they weren't even allowed out of Niamey Airport. Then today, a joint delegation of the African Union, the United Nations, and ECOWAS was due to go to Niamey tomorrow, Wednesday, the 9th of August. Today, the 8th of August, the junta this afternoon issued a statement saying that they would not receive them. They've closed the airspace, they've closed the borders. Even flights are having to be rerouted, and a glance at the map shows that Niger occupies a pretty large chunk of the map. So flights bound for Nigeria, for example, or Cameroon, are going to have to take a long way round. And they appear to be taking a very tough line. And you could say on both sides that we're in a situation where ECOWAS, having learned the lesson or drawn conclusions from the difficulty of trying to nudge the other military juntas into line and back towards elections, now promised for next year, but we don't know if they'll happen. ECOWAS decided to take a very tough line. As all the news headlines are saying, it has reserved the right to use force. But the junta is also learning from the experience of those other regimes which negotiated. It is so far refusing to negotiate over anything. And whereas the presidents who were overthrown in those previous coups were treated, as far as one knows, they were all treated fairly well, fairly correctly in terms of human rights. Bazoum is locked in his villa, but it's turned out that for the first 48 hours, he wasn't allowed any food or his family. Then food was allowed for a bit. Subsequently, it's been refused again. And so he and his wife and son and one loyal bodyguard who was with them, who's been disarmed, those four people are having to subsist on whatever remains in the kitchen cupboards, as it were, for the moment. And his phone connections have been taken away. He was talking to people. He was taking international calls. He was able to get the message out with the draft of his article. And it seems that many of us had assumed the article was just written on his behalf by a PR agency, but it seems that actually the draft, he was the source of the draft. He was able to get that out, and it was sent over to the Washington Post. Now he's effectively cut off. And when Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State from the US, so Antony Blinken's current acting deputy, she flew in. She was in Africa already on a trip. She flew into Niamey, and she asked to meet both the junta leader, General Tiani, and also Bazoum. And she was refused access to both. So she hasn't been able to see the leaders of the coup, nor has she been able to check on the condition of Bazoum and his family, about whom there's now total silence.
Well, that's sobering. Any silver lining that I was looking for there has sort of vanished. But also in what you're saying, I mean, it seems to me then that there's not going to be any kind of reversal, and that maybe leads us to maybe taking a step back, because as you said, ECOWAS is saying we want this, we want to return to democracy in Niger. Please get Bazoum back in power. You've had Niger, as you said, to say no, and like, we will treat this as war if you try to get involved here. You've had Burkina Faso and Mali come out and say, we're completely sympathetic with Niger. We will help defend Niger if ECOWAS wants to go after them. I thought it was exceptional that Nigeria's new president asked the Nigerian Senate for authority to deploy the Nigerian military. The Nigerian Senate said, no, you're not going to be allowed to do that. But Nigeria also has cut off electricity exports to Niger. My understanding is that the vast majority of electricity in Niger is actually imported from Nigeria right now, so that's going to start to hurt. You mentioned, the United States. The United States has not been willing to call it a coup quite yet. But if there are no negotiations and things really have shut down, maybe the United States will use the C word and will cut off, security cooperation and aid and all these other things that come with it. We haven't even talked yet about France and Macron and what his sort of foreign policy in the region in shambles looks like, or Russia and the Wagner Group, which is also lurking here in the background of all of this. So whereas a couple weeks ago, you're obviously somebody who is well steeped in this region. I knew where Niger was on a map. I think most people in the Western world had no idea any of this stuff was happening. Yet suddenly, all of these things are converging now in the Sahel, in this neglected part of Africa. So I don't know if there's a question in there, but I thought maybe let's take a step out and choose sort of which external actor you think is most important, or which one you want to talk about here, because Niger does seem to be now a center of gravity. We're getting all of these great power competitions and regional power competitions. It all seems to be coming to a head now in Niger.
Well, I would say, I think we can't pick out one individual actor. I think we need to think in terms of several actors. And actor number one, and really central to this story, and I'm very glad that you didn't immediately rush to a question on the Wagner Group, which we will come to, certainly, but is not the central point here. The most important issue here is the stability of, shall we call it, elected constitutional government in West Africa. If we were to step back 4 years, every single region in the ECOWAS bloc, that's 15 countries, had a constitutionally elected government. And probably the safe majority of those countries could reasonably have been described as a democracy. Sometimes democracies with flaws, certainly one or two countries like Togo, where basically the same family regime has been in power for decades, but there are elections. But still constitutional, still elected, and many countries democratic, certainly with challenges, but democratic, Nigeria, Benin, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Senegal, Guinea, Sierra Leone, etc. The Sahel itself, so Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. These countries were almost all Gambia. And in Gambia, West Africa's last card-carrying dictator, Yahya Jammeh, had been forced from office by ECOWAS pressure back at the very beginning of 2017, after he refused to accept defeat in the first free election that he'd ever allowed. So suddenly, ECOWAS is confronted with the fact that this region, and it's actually in the ECOWAS rulebook, ECOWAS has a protocol on democracy and good governance. And it's easy to mark and pick holes and point to individual flaws and human rights abuses in individual countries. But as a framework, as a regional bloc, that's something that isn't true for any other regional bloc across the African continent, I think. I might be wrong about the Southern Bloc, I'm not absolutely sure. But otherwise, it's a standard rule. Multi-party politics, a degree of genuine political choice, a significant number of countries where incumbent governments have lost elections and accepted the result and left office. And that was the sort of standard framework. And also a West African system for managing internal crises, that when crises cropped up, everybody accepted that your problem, your neighbor's problem was your problem. Your problem was your neighbor's problem. Rather than one country or another in the region taking sides, backing this or that political client, the region acted in a collective basis to try and resolve the crises within individual countries. Now, 2020, August 2020, military coup in Mali. Then May 2021, the soldiers got impatient in Mali because ECOWAS had forced them to accept that the transition government, after they staged the coup, would be led by a civilian. They got fed up with that, they staged another coup. So, coup number 2. September 21, the Guinean military step in and arrest President Alpha Condé for all those constitutional abuses I was mentioning and promise a transition. January 22, soldiers take over in Burkina Faso, frustrated by the security situation. But the soldier who led that particular coup broadly respects human rights and maintains political freedoms, tries to remain more or less within the ECOWAS mainstream and negotiate over a timetable for a transition to new elections. But then in September of last year, he himself deposed by impatient younger officers who've adopted a much more radical stance. So it's after that you've had 5 coups in 3 countries in less than 3 years. And in that situation, that's what confronted ECOWAS. And already over recent months, they had been working on plans to toughen up the bloc's internal political rules, while also so that some of the abuses, some of the political manipulations that had caused such popular frustration and created conditions where soldiers felt they could step in and seize power, but while also toughening up provisions to try and counter the risk of military coups. And in fact, Bazoum himself, only 2 weeks ago, was in a meeting in Nigeria to discuss this with other regional leaders. And then Niger Coup, that's why ECOWAS has felt it's had to take such a tough line. And behind it is the international community. And that you can think of, if you like, in layers. So ECOWAS is the regional bloc. What's really significant is the African Union, in other words, the bloc to which all African countries belong. The African Union is completely endorsing the ECOWAS position and standing behind ECOWAS. It's because West Africa has this very strong tradition of managing its own crises that the African Union, rather than in taking the lead itself, is backing ECOWAS on this, if you like. ECOWAS is the body that is deemed by other international actors to have the legitimacy to decide if a country's government is legitimate, and where there is a crisis or a coup, what the rules are for getting back to civilian rule. And beyond the African Union, then the United Nations, which of course all African countries are members of. So those are the organizations that Niger itself belongs to: ECOWAS, African Union, United Nations, in layers of support. And then the other actors, outside actors, I guess the most important ones in this situation at the moment are the US, France, and the European Union. Of course, France is a member of the EU, but France, it's not so much that it's the former colonial power, though that is significant, and it's the main customer and main of the uranium produced in the mines in Niger, which are a joint venture between French and Nigerian interests. That's uranium for the French nuclear power industry. But France is also a key donor, and France and the US are the 2 largest military partners of Niger. So there's something like 1,100 American troops in Niger, and they have a big major drones base in the north of the country on the edge of the Sahara in Agadez, and France, which has about 1,500 troops in Niger. And that troop presence is at the level it is today because President Bazoum specifically requested that France expand it after the French fell out with Mali, or Mali fell out with the French, and the French troops had to pull out of Mali, and then Burkina Faso. Niger felt even more exposed to the risk of attack by these jihadist groups in the Sahel, and they asked France to keep some of its troops, redeploy some of its troops to Niger to supplement forces that were already there. And then the EU are on a twin track, if you like. Because obviously, it's 27 countries, so that's a really big block of international weight. It includes not just France, but Germany, which is also a major donor. And there are a number of EU countries that have troops in Niger, either special forces deployed in Task Force Takuba, which is a European operation that was originally in Mali but was then moved south into Niger to counter the jihadist threat, or else on training exercises. So, for example, the Nigerian special forces have been trained by Germany over a number of years. The Italians have a substantial military training operation. The Belgians have been training troops. The Czech Republic had announced a few months ago plans to do military training Nigerian forces. And the EU also has a long-running program of training Nigerian police, gendarmerie, and paramilitary, government paramilitary forces, the sort of Nigerian equivalent of the US National Guard, if you like. Mm-hmm. So Europe is a big security actor. So those are the key players. I mean, in economic terms, China is a big actor. China is doing a lot of, as in many parts of Africa, infrastructure projects, economic interests. The Chinese operate Niger's oil field. It's a minor oil producer, but that oil production is going to ratchet up because the Chinese are building a pipeline. The oil at the moment is refined locally and used for the local market in Niger and northern Nigeria. But the pipeline means that soon Niger will be able to export to the world market. Alongside all of those, Russia will be a relatively new player. Niger has had, shall we say, a correct diplomatic relationship with Russia, like any other country. It's bought Russian military equipment because the Russians do make a lot of defense equipment, which is supplied to many different countries in Africa. Now there's speculation that the junta that seized power in Niamey is in the process of trying to bring in Wagner. General Salifou Modi, who is the number 2 in the junta, flew to Bamako 2 or 3 days ago for talks with the Malians, but it's speculated that he was also talking to Wagner, who are, of course, well dug in Mali. And there are Wagner units in the part of Mali which is closest to Niger, just a few hours' drive from Niamey. And while Wagner might not have the forces to be a massive military deployment in Niger at the moment, obviously they could fly troops in. Wagner are also in Libya, which has a border with Niger in the middle of the Sahara. Wagner, even a small number of Wagner troops would make life additionally rather more complicated for any ECOWAS military operation if all the efforts at mediation and negotiation fail to produce results, and we end up with a situation where ECOWAS does feel it has no choice but to act on its threat of force.
Well, and as you said, thus far it looks like the economic negotiations and the sanctions and all these things like that are hardening the junta's resolve rather than softening it in any way. So the next question there is, do you think that there is any hope for that, or does this have to become a security military solution? And then the next question on top of that is, I mean, there have been examples of this recently in Africa. I'm thinking most recently of Mozambique, where you had a regional force with South Africa leading the way, but a bunch of different soldiers from a bunch of different countries go into the northern part of Mozambique and try and beat down a jihadist insurgency there. They've tried a similar thing in the DRC to much less effect. If anything, they've made things worse there. But we're not talking about a jihadist insurgency. We're talking about, a junta that has seized control, that you say has control of the Niger army. I mean, who is bringing the guns? Who's bringing the soldiers in ECOWAS? I would imagine the Europeans are trigger shy after the disaster in Libya over a decade ago. Is the United States really going to commit to this with everything else that is going on in the world? I wonder if Niger looks at the threats and says, okay, what are you going to do to us? Is that a fair way of looking at it?
That is a fair way of looking at it, up to a point. Certainly, Niger has one of the largest armies in the Sahel. It's pretty well trained. It has a 25,000 strong army. In fact, Bazoum made a point of ensuring that the army was well looked after and trained and equipped. But remember that army is also deployed tackling the threat from Boko Haram. There's been a big overspill of violent banditry from northern Nigeria, so the army is also busy on the center, south, along the border with Nigeria. And above all, the army is concerned with facing the threat posed by the big jihadist alliances in the Sahel, Islamic State in the Greater Sahara and JNIM, both based in northern Mali. And those jihadist groups, the areas where they're active, very active, are only a few hours drive from Niamey. So the army had a big challenge on its hands. It was working very closely with the French above all, but also with the other Europeans and with the US, but actually engaged in joint operations with the French to try and better protect those borders. Well, of course, the French, because they do not want to be seen in interfering in internal affairs, and also because the junta has now denounced all the defense agreements with France, obviously the army is not able to cooperate with the French at the moment. At least perhaps it's doing so in one or two local locations that nobody's saying much about. But at an overall level, that joint partnership is sort of frozen. And if the Niger army reorients itself towards focusing on a potential threat from an ECOWAS intervention, that's going to leave very many vulnerable areas of Niger exposed. We also know that large parts of the army were not at the start, particularly in support of this coup at all. And how they would react if the putschists try and call them in aid, if you like, it's a situation that's very hard to read. So there are limits to the degree to which the junta can defy the outside world and ECOWAS in terms of military force. And we can add that the offers of military help from Mali and from Burkina Faso, you have to, again, put in mind those two countries are struggling to retain control of their own territory. They are not really in a position to redeploy large numbers of troops to Niger. But just as it's a really tough situation for the junta from that sort of security point of view, it's also a very, very tough situation for ECOWAS, because whether you talk about a big military operation using, as it were, the large clout of the Nigerian army, along with troops from some of the other more militarily capable countries in West Africa, or whether you're talking about some sort of very, very focused special forces operation, whatever form it takes, it's going to be pretty high risk. And the political risks will be massive, because there's obviously a significant chance that people could be killed. And so that's a really, really difficult conundrum. So that's that's what's leading people to wonder whether essentially having drawn an initial very firm line, basically what ECOWAS had seen was that before, in the previous coup crises, if you want to call it that, um, by just leaving a relatively open timetable for negotiations, and in the case of Mali, bringing in some sanctions down the line for a limited period, none of that really exerted a lot of leverage. So they wanted to set, I think, a very early, what you might call, deadline for legitimizing whatever tough action they might take. So that deadline that was set last weekend, saying to the putschists, give up, go back to the barracks, that I think we should look at that really as a deadline for saying, that's when letting bygones be bygones. We'll forget all about it. No problem. You just return back to your barracks, free Bazoum, everything back to normal. No questions asked. I think we should think of it like that. I don't think it means that ECOWAS was saying the morning after, if you still haven't uh, returned everything to normal and freed Bazoum, we will invade. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the package of sanctions, it's really very tough. Niger is a landlocked country. Most of its trade flows through Nigeria and Benin. And it depends substantially on exporting to coastal West Africa, exporting livestock, exporting certain vegetables like onions and potatoes that can grow in Niger's dry climate but don't grow very well in the tropical coastal climate of sort of southern Nigeria or Cote d'Ivoire, whatever. So Niger depends a lot. A lot of Nigerians go and work in coastal West Africa seasonally. You know, there are all sorts of economic ties, particularly the relationship between northern Nigeria and south central Niger is really deep. And so the sanctions can have a very serious effect. And also, Niger is part of the West African CFA's franc single currency bloc. Mm-hmm. So the country's central bank is not in Niamey. The central bank is in Dakar, in Senegal. And through the single currency and the central banking system, they can cause huge disruption and potentially paralysis to the normal financial system and the electronic payment system, for example, within the country. So I suspect that having drawn that very firm stance at first, ECOWAS will then wait to see how the sanctions pressure begins to exert itself on the junta, and then hope that these efforts to provoke a negotiation eventually begin to prise open, if you like, the tin. The junta, it's as if the junta sort of shut itself in a box. But to try and prise open the door a little, when they rejected the planned mediation mission today, they didn't say, we will never talk. They said, because the Nigerian people are very upset about the impact of sanctions, blah, blah, blah. Now we can't accept a delegation now. We need a plan that will set out a proper date for the mission to visit and what's going to be on the agenda, what's going to be talked about. Well, that's only a tiny sort of fillet, but there's a little window to get something in. When Victoria Nuland did go, she did manage to get into the country. So the first ECOWAS mission never met anybody, but she was able to get in. She was able to have 2 hours of talks. She couldn't meet the top people. They refused to meet her. But she was able to talk to some people. So little by little, a bit what seems like an absolutist position from the junta at the moment might become a little more flexible. And the prime minister they've appointed, of course, he has no political power. He's been installed by them But he is somebody who, having had a long period as finance minister and being very well acquainted with the IMF and the World Bank and that sort of thing, will be able to explain to the military leaders the significance of the financial sanctions that have been put on the country. So I think that ECOWAS will focus on that. And there's also a very strong political reason why it will take that approach, which is that in various ECOWAS states, countries that would be important troop contributors, Senegal, and Nigeria particularly, their opposition politicians have raised concerns. And as you mentioned, the Senate at the moment has refused to approve military action. So ECOWAS leaders, they've got a big persuading job to do, and they absolutely need to show that they have gone the extra mile. They have done everything they can to nudge Niger to nudge the Nigerian junta towards some sort of negotiated process. Um, and I mean, obviously, somebody might say, "Oh, well, what about the element of surprise?" Well, I guess had it been feasible, had ECOWAS sent in a special forces mission within the hours after President Bazoum was being detained, when everything was rather uncertain right at the very start, to jump in, dive in, and rescue him, perhaps the element of sort of sudden secret surprise might have been possible. But realistically, of course, that couldn't have happened because everybody was still adjusting to what it was just taking place. And now it's not going to be a surprise. Now, inevitably, this is something that's going to take time and going to have to be prepared and worked out carefully. So, in a sense, ECOWAS isn't losing anything by holding out for a bit more, for a longer period of negotiation. And it needs to show other actors in Africa, and there are people, for example, Algeria has said it's opposed to military action. Now, the Algerians tend to have a habit of being of thinking of themselves as major international actors on the African scene. And traditionally, they have exercised a lot of diplomatic weight, and they do have a border with Niger. But Algeria is also worried, keen to maintain its influence in sub Saharan Africa. And if most sub Saharan countries decide to really push hard, then that, and stick with a very tough line against the junta, then it will be difficult for Algeria to resist it. And that may, and perhaps this is a good sort of concluding point to mention, it may also explain why the Russian government, so President Putin, called for the restoration of constitutional rule, because he's just hosted a summit in St. Petersburg to which he invited a lot of African leaders. Now, many didn't even go at all, partly because they were angered by his withdrawal from the Black Sea grain deal. And those that did go, although one or two military putschist leaders did turn up, of course, the overwhelming majority of presidents who arrived were presidents who come to office through constitutional process. And they will have been sending the message to the Russians, look, if you want to extend your influence in Africa, you're not going to do it by supporting the principle that armies can always seize power and overthrow legitimate presidents. So I think all those different contributing factors mean that ECOWAS will maintain a very firm public stance and be backed in doing so by the international community, but it will actually wait a bit of time. I mean, all this is uncertain. Perhaps we'll wake up tomorrow morning and find that some special operation has overturned everything while we were sleeping. But my best guess is that ECOWAS will maintain a sort of very tough stance and put the preparations in and tighten up the enforcement of sanctions, etc., 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 but while pushing for negotiation.
I'm glad you mentioned Algeria because, that regime, or that I should say that government is also paranoid about jihadists. So if you really did get a breakdown in security in the middle of the Sahel, I would imagine that they would also have something to say about that. And I don't have high hopes that Russia is going to stop with its hypocrisy that, it's against military invention on one end, but then it's, Putin just dealt with a mutiny at home. So it's not a very good look to be supporting a mutiny in another country anyway. Paul, thank you so much for making the time. This was terrific. I hope you got something out of it too, and maybe we can have you back in 3 or 6 months and check in on this because unfortunately, I don't think things are getting any calmer or more stable in this part of the world in the near term.
I certainly don't think so. It's been a pleasure to be with you, Jacob, and really interesting to talk over what's going on in Niger and the wider Sahel.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.